Hey guys, I want to talk to you about something that really leveled up my mixing and really helped me get my head around certain things and actually helped to train my ears, which was relying on my eyes. Now, obviously, all the pros will tell you mix with your ears, not your eyes. Don't worry about what it looks like on the plugin, whatever it is you're tweaking or what the amp controls look like. If it sounds good, go with it and kind of train your ears to figure out how to mix really well. And that is 100% true. But something that I've done for years that is so easy in terms of just referencing and not kind of getting, mix blind, which is a term a lot of people use in the industry. If you've been mixing for a few hours, you might kind of go down a rabbit hole and then quickly reference something, and then you realize you've gone way too muddy or way too bright and not enough line, that kind of thing. So the main things that I noticed that helped me with my mixing, the main thing was getting a really decent set of monitors. The moment I got those, I noticed a huge improvement in my mixes. I use Adam S2V monitors, which I've had since 2017. And the speakers I had before that were terrible. And that made a huge difference. The next thing was acoustic treatment panels. The room I'm in currently is like a temporary thing, so it's not the best sounding space. I have got panels up all over, and I've got bass straps in the corners there. One behind me there. I don't have a bass strap there because the door to the room is there. So this room is not perfect by any means, but there is a good amount of treatment up in here anyway. I can't stress it enough that although plugins, buying new plugins, oh, my mixes will sound better if I get this plugin, it's really about the speakers and your room treatment and the room you're in for the most part. But what I'm going to talk about today, I personally use one particular plugin for this. Maybe you can kind of use others, but I think this is the best one for what I'm about to do. I have no affiliation whatsoever with FabFilter. I'm going to be talking about the Pro Q3 EQ. There is a Pro Q4, which I've actually already purchased, but I haven't installed it yet. So as I said, I have no affiliation to them. They're not sponsoring this video or anything like that. But for me, the Pro Q2 originally, that's the one that I used for the most part to train myself up. And then the Pro Q3 and now the Pro Q4. To me, they have the best spectrum or frequency analyzer in terms of seeing what your tones look like, in terms of seeing what your kick curve looks like, seeing what your snares look like, and seeing what your guitar tones look like. So for me, one of the most useful things I've done is rip kick drums, snare drums off albums I like, if I can find a singular hit that I can sample, or bits of guitar chugging if there's just a riff on its own, and then just a bit of like down picking, that kind of thing, and sampling those and looking at them in FabFilter EQ. And I'll show you now exactly how I go about doing that, and I'm just going to use Solosis stuff as a reference. Okay, so this is something that I've done for years, and it's not really a secret, but I'm just going to show you because no one really talks about doing this. What I always used to do was just like take CDs of albums that I liked and rip them onto my computer and then imported those tracks into Cubase. Sometimes I'd have like a whole album ripped to my iTunes, import all the WAV files in and just look at the whole album, and I could just see where isolated guitars were, or if there was an isolated drum fill where I might be able to pinch a kick or a snare drum. And just use them as a reference, because they're just going to be one-shot samples. They might not be perfect. Sometimes you might sample a kick or a snare where there's a bit too much room mic or a hi-hat over the snare. But either way, it can still be useful. So for the first sample we're going to look at, this is by no means my favorite kick drum, but I just knew that this was one that we could try and sample. So this is the start of Cycle of Suffering by Solosis. So the song starts with a quick drum fill, and it starts with a 2/16 notes on the kicks. Now these are super close to each other, and we're not going to get any real sustain from the drum, and it's not going to sound great. It's going to sound like a little blip. And because I'm just trying to do this with Solosis stuff, this was the easiest one, or the first one that came to mind for a kick drum. And now I'm going to put it on. It's kind of hard to know exactly where the start of the hit is. Some of this is some sort of swelling guitar noise at the start of the track as well. So for the actual kick, I'm going to chop it there. I've done a fade out just before the next kick comes in. It's not going to sound the best. It's going to sound like a little blip, but essentially this is now just a singular kick drum. And what I can do with that is export it as a WAV file. So the Cycle of Suffering kick drum, always make sure you label what the sample rate is, just in case you work with different sample rates. It will come in handy. So that is a kick drum from Cycle of Suffering at 48K. Going to export it as mono. That's done. And I'm going to show you how I utilize and look at these in a mix context and how this is going to help me with referencing in my own mixes. Next up, we've got this drum fill in Soured Ground from the new EP. And although there are other drums in this fill, I feel I can get quite a clean snare. Now there is a bit of coming off the floor tom, which is sustaining from this hit here, which isn't ideal, but in this instance it'll be enough to kind of just hear and see what the snare drum's doing. Again, you can probably find albums where there's a really clear and easy snare or kick sample to choose from. Again, just to, I don't know, make things easier for myself, I'm just doing it with solo sys stuff. Again, you want a bit more sustain on these samples if possible. That's just what that sounds like. I think I can afford to, with a snare drum, lose anything below at least 150 that could be like, you know, sustained from the floor tom, that sort of thing. And there is still going to be an element of floor tom in here. So this is by no means the best example of a clean sample. Either way, just going to show you what I do. So pretty much not much going on my snares below this, so I'm just going to kill anything that might be coming from that floor tom that might still be sustaining. That sounds a bit better, and then I'm going to export that as a snare. So that is, I'm going to do it as Soured Ground snare, 48K, because cool. So we've got that now. As I said, these samples, this kick drum and that snare, are not, I don't think, my best mixes. I think the mix on the song The Path, which is a different mix to the rest of the EP, which is all B-sides from the album, I think that's one of my best mixes, but there's nothing isolated in that song that we can harvest. So that's why I'm showing you this stuff. Okay, so next we can check out a guitar. Now, what you could do is just find this loop, find what the tempo of the song is. It's something like 178 or 180 something, I don't know. Maybe it's nowhere near that. But what you would do is trying to find, you could tap the tempo in your DAW, trying to find the exact tempo of the song, try and cut the guitar out and just make a loop. And it's always good to just get a single note. Just a single note chugging, whether it be an open or just a single note, because the only way you should really reference against the guitar tone is if you are playing the exact same single note. If you just have a riff that you've sampled off a record and then you play your own riff in a different tuning and you try and do an EQ match, obviously the frequency analyzer is going to be dancing all around depending on what note is playing. So the only way to really reference a guitar tone and look at the frequency analyzer is mimic something very specific, like one single note. So if you've got a bit of drop D, single D riffing, make sure you're referencing your own tone with some drop D riffing at the same tempo. And another thing, you know, as a guitarist, you've really got to pay attention to the way the palm muting is done, and more experienced players will be able to think about ways they can adjust their playing to replicate the playing that they're listening to. All of these factors will help. This way of referencing tones is by no means perfect. You've got to have a fair bit of understanding around, you know, pickups, amps, playing, mic placement. You can't just run an EQ match and expect to get a very similar result. Up next, I'm going to look at this bit in Poison for the Lost. Now I've got I know this song is 202 BPM, so I've changed the BPM of my project to 202. And I'm just going to try and line it up with the grid and find like a snare hit. So roughly there. So the only bit I can really get as a good reference of that low C sharp chugging is just a few dun 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 duns here. And, you know, I can just paste it like this. Now, I know as the person that mixed this song that I bring in guitars when they're on their own. I don't like them being completely hard panned. It sounds really annoying, especially in headphones, so I bring them in a bit. So for what I'm about to do, I'm going to try and come away with a stereo file to reference, because I think that's a better way of referencing within a mix context, so you can drop these files into your mixes. I'm going to try and find some other guitar from the same song for the other side. So I'm going to pan these to the left. And there's a bit of a issue there, so I need to crossfade them, see if that is any better. Sounds a bit weird, but either way, this is just a basic kind of reference. And then we've got this riff later on in the song. Another bit of down picking. I know that it's not a copy and pasted bit of down picking, so I can, with good conscience, steal it, because I know it's going to be a different take. So if you had the same, like if I just duplicated that and put that pan to the right, it's just going to come out mono, because you can't double up a single guitar track. Cool, so there's a good chunk there. So what I can do with that is go into Cubase and stereo flip it, new version, and then I'm gonna put this on a different track. Make sure it's hard panned as well. I'll put these both to 0. And then just do a crossfade on them as well. And then I should have double tracked guitars. So again, this isn't a perfect sample of a tone. In the background on the right side, we have this kind of ambient wall of sort of dive bombing guitars on a Floyd Rose. So you can hear a bit of that on this right guitar. But the left side, pretty clear. So what I would do then, if I had like a really clean guitar tone to look at, again, just referencing a single note, is just load it up on FabFilter. So basically, this is what a lot of guitar tones I like in mixes look like. Usually a dip around here, and usually the peak of the high end is coming through between 3 to 4K, which is normally a problematic area, but it's an area where all the aggression is. So you want to make sure you've kind of notched out some of the whistly frequencies to then go in and boost this kind of harsh area, but that is where the aggression and the teeth of your tone is. Yeah. Now, this isn't the perfect tone. I think my mixes have come on a lot better in the past few years since I did this. And I think the guitar tone on the Path, which is the exact same tone, the source tone, as in it's from the same reamp session. I just mix the guitars differently. I just different EQ moves, that kind of thing. So anyway, I can kind of just reference that tone. If I wanted to replicate that tone exactly, I can just see what it looks like. And as long as I'm playing in the same just C sharp single note, down picked, palm muted riff, or just a single note, it's a lot easier to reference where you might be going wrong in your own mixes. You might be like, oh, I've got this huge spike here in my tone. I couldn't really tell with my ears like where that was coming from, but now if I just notch it to make my tone look more like this one, that can be, you know, a way to level up your mixing and just kind of learn. And not even learn. I mean, admittedly, you're just going to be using your eyes, and I just did this for the longest time. I feel like a hack saying it, but doing this over and over again just trained my ears up to know after a while that when I'm referencing all these great mixes that I love, or great tones, my ear just gravitates towards those sounds naturally now, and now I just have a better knowledge of knowing what I'm looking for or listening for when I am dialing in, kicks, bass, drums, tones. So obviously you can use EQ matching, and most DAWs will have their own just EQ where you can do simple EQ matching. That is obviously one way to go about it. I find EQ matching is going to be so specific, and you normally get this really big squiggly line. The more kind of intense and aggressive EQing you do, the more weirder your tones might sound. So just using the FabFilter frequency analyzer just to give you a really clear idea of just looking at the tones, where the differences may be, is a much better way of doing it, because you can kind of see like, oh, my tone is too bright or has a big spike or a big hole in this area, and I need to do something about that. But just relying on EQ matching can sound a bit too weird, and you don't want to over EQ your source tone. You kind of just want to work with what you've got to a certain extent. Anyway, so let's come back to the drums, and I'm going to show you how I would use those drum samples now as a reference. So I've currently got my drum plugin loaded up, Ultimate Heavy Drums, and this is a re-recording or cover, if you want, of After Lifeless Years off our very first record. I'm just going to loop this section here. And the preset I'm using is mid-2000s metalcore kit. It wasn't actually meant to sound like the drums on our record, but a bunch of these kind of famous drum samples made their way onto most records in the mid-2000s. It sounds a lot like Alive or Just Breathing. There's actually no one-shot blended in on that sample. That is literally just the sound of that drum. It's a Ludwig Supraphonic tuned down pretty low. Anyway, what I'm going to do in this instance, let's say you're working with either program drums or you're just working with drums that are real audio, or your program drums have been exported as audio. I've got a bunch of one-shot samples here that I've copied and pasted just for that beat. And let's just pretend that these are either your real kick drum or real snare drum, or even your samples, and you want to reference samples from an album you like. You're like, oh, I really want to have a kick drum that sounds like that, or a snare drum that sounds like that. So using the two samples I made earlier, I'm going to show you how you can go about referencing them. So, and by the way, these samples that you're hearing here are free one-shot samples from the Middleton newsletter. So on this kick track, let's pretend this is like a real kick drum, or the kick drum that I'm wanting to mix, and not just the pre-mix one-shot. I'm going to load up Slate Trigger, and I'm going to import that kick sample that we made earlier. Okay, so I've got that Cycle of Suffering kick drum loaded in here. I exported it a bit quiet. I was just rushing whilst making this video, so I've got it absolutely cranked on the volume here. So this is how it sounds, and this is how it sounds now in the mix. So that is the Cycle of Suffering kick drum over this mix, and we can listen to the original sample. If I put this mix control here back to 0, we can go between the two. So I can hear with my ears, without looking, that the high end on this sample is a bit higher up than I'm getting a bit more kind of like 2 to 4K on the sample here that we're hearing when the mix control is at 0. And I can show you using FabFilter what we can see changing when I change that mix control and just loop it. So Cycle of Suffering kick, one-shot kick, so they're quite similar, and obviously I gravitate towards certain sounding kick drums. I can see on the Cycle of Suffering kick there's a little bit less subby low end, so if we look around just specifically in this area we can see it change. Getting a bit more of a bump around here in the low end, in the sub. And then the peak of the high end is coming through there. And it's, you know, got a bit more of a jagged edge to it, this other one-shot sample, but it's actually a bit more flattened out. So we're hearing a bit more of this 2 to 4K area. And even a little bit more of this 10K area. Because although there's, you know, peaks and troughs in this area here, generally it's not focusing in and rising up at one point. It's sort of flat in a way. So from here to here, quite similar in level. So that's how I could reference and make some EQ moves to make this kick drum sound more like the Circle of Suffering one. So by doing that, I could just go, take out some of that sub, remove some of the sub that we have too much of, if I wanted to go that route. And then take out a bit of this. And already that's in a closer ballpark. Okay, so let's do the same sort of thing we just did then with the snare. Now, before I do this, it's worth noting that when you've got snares and you're trying to reference one snare for one record to a snare you're working on, the tuning of the snare is going to make a huge difference. So you can't, you know, reference like a really pingy, high-pitched snare sample and then a really fat one, because the low end is going to be in a different place altogether, because, you know, drums have a note and there's certain pitches and overtones that could be coming through. So I've got the SoundGround snare sample here. This is on a mono track. I should have actually exported that or imported it onto a stereo track because there's a bit of like room mic width in there. But just to give you a similar look at similar things we can look out for. Now, first of all, in the mix, I'm going to listen to this and try and match the tuning of the snare to the other sample. Pretending that this sample is like your real snare, or the snare that you're working on and trying to mix, I need to make sure that the tuning of the sample that I'm going to be referencing is in a similar ballpark. So I'm going to be using this control here to do that. It's quite hard to tell. Obviously, with snare drums, there can be all sorts of overtones that you're listening out for, but it's in a similar ballpark. Now, I actually prefer the sound of this one-shot sample than the sample I've got from SoundGround. Either way, let's kind of look at what we could do if that was the sample or the snare sound that we were wanting to emulate. So I'm going to have it on this side. I normally have it on the left. I don't know why I did it on the right last time. So this is how SoundGround looks. Pretty standard for me that the low end of my snare and the high end of my snare will peak at a similar point in terms of the level. And then usually a bit more scooped around this area, particularly around like 1K. So that's what the SoundGround snare looks like. And bear in mind that it's just a singular hit. Every snare hit is going to be slightly different. So this is by no means the perfect hit either. And then let's look at the snare that we're going to try and make sound like that. Okay, so there's a few things. I'm seeing a bit of a spike on the SoundGround snare there, and that's just going to be the nature of that specific hit. It's not like a thing that's going to be sticking out on every single hit, so we could duck that out. I'm seeing a lot more mid-range as well on that snare sound. It's also worth bearing in mind that some of that mid-range that I'm seeing is actually coming from the room mics, and you might not want to process your close mic snare sound emulating a one-shot sample that does have room mics really loudly in it. That's another thing to bear in mind. Another thing I'm seeing on the other snare is a lot more like high end. So I'm actually doing the opposite this time. I'm actually making the SoundGround snare sound a bit more like the one that I think sounds better, which has a bit more like above 10K. got a bit more low end to it as well. And I think I've sort of tackled the fundamental a bit. So not the best example of doing that, but that is just something that you can do and you can practice doing. So by no means is this the perfect demonstration of the perfect sounds, but that's one way of doing it. Now, the reason I'm using this After Lifeless Years project is because I did this kind of referencing with the guitars from the album. So these are the guitars from the record. And let's see if I can make a stereo image out of those. So I'm going to pan that one side, pan that the other side, and stereo flip. So basically I've got now left and right guitars from the record, so I can just copy and paste them to where I need them over here, and then just switch between the album guitar tone and my guitar tone. Let's go to my guitars. Not identical, but very similar. I mean, obviously, everything, like the nuances of the performance and everything is going to be different. And the main thing is I'm using a different cabinet. And the main thing that colors and shapes a guitar tone is the exact speaker you're using, because no matter how many vintage 30s you may have, they're all different. Even in the same cab, they're all different. So with a guitar tone, as I said, you really need to just be referencing a single note, either chugging, palm muting. Typically, I prefer palm muting than like a chord ringing out. I think a palm muted riff is the easiest way to really see how a tone is shaped and sculpted, and especially when it comes to the low end in terms of palm muting, because that's when you really know what you're dealing with and how locked in your low end is. So this is what the guitars look like from the record. Quite a subby amount of low end here. We've got a lot of low end around like 75-ish. And a lot of people are kind of high pass filtering their guitars out there. To like 100. It immediately makes those guitars sound way thinner. This is in E standard. Now, obviously, if you're dealing with 8 strings and that kind of thing, I might be more inclined to get rid of a bit more low end. But if you're closer to standard tuning, don't just automatically do a high pass filter like this just because everyone else is doing it. Definitely do one, but just do it to like 60 and retain some of that low end. Because that is like a really pleasing amount of low end for this tone. Anyway, so another thing I can see is there's a bit of a notch around here. Now either the cab just doesn't have a lot of like 2.7 or it's been notched out by Scott. And then we can look at my tone now. We'll just find a bit that is just the chugging without any of the riffy bits and see how that looks by comparison. So it's by no means exactly the same. I could maybe remove a little bit more of this. And maybe a little bit more around like 4.2 as well. And then bring that overall area up a bit as well. So I'm not using an EQ match, but this is all kind of just ways to visually see where you might be going wrong or to get you there a lot quicker. And using references is something that most people do. I mean, even if you're just using your ears, most people are using reference mixes. But I think using something like FabFilter Pro Q3, when you're in a more beginner kind of phase of getting into mixing, it's just going to be so instant in terms of the feedback that you get. Why doesn't your kick drum sound like that kick drum? Aside from maybe the tuning or the source material, maybe it's just you've got a completely different EQ curve drawn in, and you might be trying to put high-end boost that in somewhere where the actual kick is maybe focused a little bit further down, and you maybe can't just hear that yet with your ears. So I don't tend to use EQ matching. I just use the FabFilter EQ to kind of help guide me and just instantly see where things may look different. But ultimately, no matter how good you may think you have your, let's say your guitars balanced out, balancing out the low end and the high end in the mix is really tricky with guitars, making them sound kind of menacing and aggressive and have that high end to cut through, but also not too thin if you are boosting high end. So that is the sort of thing you do just need to use your ears for. But this is a technique that I've kind of done for years, and also it just helps me when it comes to, I like to try and reverse engineer a lot of my favorite mixes. So it's not something that I always do just for my own mixing, but if I want to replicate a mix, as you may have seen on YouTube, I've done various mix recreation videos, and if I can find some isolated guitars or an isolated kick or snare from that album, that makes my life so much easier when I'm trying to rebuild a mix. So if you see the Chimera one I did, particularly with Inside the Horror, I could just loop that section of chugging from the record and try and match the way I'm playing, try and get as close as I think I could with the source tone, and then just use some EQ in the mix to finesse my tone to get it closer, and using FabFilter EQ to really see. And out of all the EQs I've seen or used, I think that one's got the best visualizer in terms of how accurate it is and how easy it is to kind of read and see where you might be going wrong. So that's something I've done a lot. I think that's really helped with my mixing. A lot of people will say, use your ears, not your eyes. I do agree, but I still use my eyes as well. So one final add-on, just a fun fact for you guys. If you listen to Pantera's 5 Minutes Alone, the start of the song is a baguette drum fill, and you can sample the kick off that, which a lot of people have done, and it's made its way onto various mixes. Now, if you look at the kick drum on that record in FabFilter, the high end outweighs the low end. So I think a lot of people have sort of like boosted in low end or maybe blended in other samples. But I know that sample has made it onto the following records: Machine Head, The More Things Change. That's a Pantera sample. At the Gate, Slaughter of the Soul. That is the Pantera 5 Minutes Alone kick. Puritanical by Dimmu Borgir. I'm assuming it's probably been on a lot of Fredrik Nordstrom records, because he said he used it on, if you look at the making of Slaughter of the Soul, they say in that they sampled it from that record. An interview with Nick Barker that I saw recently, he said that they used the Pantera sample on Puritanical. And it's also, I think, on Nihility by Decapitated. So ripping drum samples from records is nothing new. But if you want some really clean, deliberately made one-shot samples, sign up to the Middleton mailing list and you'll get some free one-shot samples sent out to you automatically. Check your junk mail if you don't see it.